Now we'll move on quickly to our next session, which is a conversation on U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. place in the world. And we have with us two of our most experienced and illustrious U.S. diplomats and leaders of our organization, Ambassador Thomas Pickering and Frank Wisner. The session will be moderated by Mina Loraibi, the editor-in-chief of The National.
A fascinating topic, America's place in the world. And we have two not only distinguished diplomats, but brilliant speakers who can take us through this. So there's a number of points I wanted to discuss with you about America's place in the world, and of course, how relevant it is for our region. And then, of course, we'll open the floor to questions. I wanted to start with you, Ambassador Wisner, just off the back of the meeting between President Biden and President Xi of China. That's just happened. It seemed to be a moment when there was a de-escalation. Often now when we think about America's place in the world, we're thinking, how's that relationship with China going to develop? So I want to go straight into a newsy topic, and then we'll take it out broader into more thematics.
Mina, first of all, thank you for organizing, running this panel. And I want to say thank you as well to NYU, Abu Dhabi, for the occasion. These conferences are really an important part of the life of AGSIW, and I'm very proud, very pleased to participate this year. This, in fact, while I followed them from a distance in the past, to be part of it is a special privilege. I think you begin your inquiry, Mina, by asking the question Americans ask themselves first and foremost. What is the greatest challenge that America, as an issue of national security, faces going forward through the rest of this century? And I think you would find no quarrel at all among Americans that the issue is China. That doesn't mean that we have agreed on the means for dealing with the challenge of the rise of China. We have not. There are various ways of looking at it. But the fact that we look at China as our principal competitor is clearly core to any understanding of American foreign policy. I am, however, going to briefly say that I fully agree with Bill Roebuck's statement in the previous panel that we have adjusted our view of the role the United States must play in this region, and it's not unrelated to China. I believe that adjustment has occurred, and that we have reconfigured this region in terms of our strategic priorities, and that the nations of this region can look to the United States as a changing but still central security factor in their own future. Now, coming back to the question of President Biden and Xi Jinping, it's really interesting. Both of them came to the table at the G20 from domestic victories. Xi clearly organized the 20th Party Congress in a manner that reinforced his political power, reinforced his party position, reinforced his hold on ideology, reinforced his hold on the direction of China's economy, and positioned himself and the Chinese leadership, which he, in an untrammeled way, runs. Joe Biden can't quite say that. The results of the election in the United States are decidedly, given our constitutional system, more ambiguous. Nonetheless, he approaches the table from a renewed sense of confidence in the purposes and directions of American diplomacy. A diplomacy that I would underscore, Mina, is changing in the way the United States deals with issues in the world, from an assumption of agency to an assumption of cooperation. Well, it is critically important, with China rising, with America standing still at a hugely important point in the global security system, economic system, political system, that these two sides understand one another and stay out of each other's way, and at least do not, no crisis develops. I believe we haven't quite reached that point, but what struck me about the Xi meeting with Joe Biden is that the two of them agreed that it is vitally important to establish, to use American slang, guardrails, that there are issues that we have to understand each other so that we know not to walk on each other's toes and lose control of our capacity to maintain peace and avoid war. War with China is literally unthinkable. It should never be fought. I think the Chinese see it that way, but we cannot overlook the accidental. This is a serious problem that we have to face. So the Xi-Biden meetings established a set of issues which they wisely referred to discussions between governmental experts, within which they can set out, each side can set out what is sensitive, what is dangerous, and how to manage it. And so it's the beginning of what could be, we must hope will be, a sustained way of dealing with this hugely important challenge. The outcome, Mina, in my mind, has three elements to it. Yes, the United States will confront China where we believe China oversteps. Second, the United States will compete vigorously with China internationally, in terms of alliance building, in technology. In many ways, we will compete with China. But third, we have to cooperate in order to maintain the peace and to maintain some degree of global sanity. So these three C's, to confront, to compete, and to cooperate, are now the formal structure within which I believe our policies will be pursued. And the curtain was raised at the G20 in Indonesia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that overview. That focuses on those elements of compete, confront, but also cooperate. And it almost, at certain points, feels that the three together simultaneously can be impossible, but have to work in order to avoid that collision that we all worry about. Ambassador Pickering, I want to turn to you first about the assessment of this meeting between President Biden and President Xi, and to what extent we can see it as this, not a new chapter, but kind of a new page being turned, and for us to see the framing of the relationship, but also how much that is determining the very complex American foreign policy set of issues, but determines how America views the world today.
Thank you, Mina, for a very good follow-on question. And before I go further, I join Frank in his thanks to you and to New York University and to all the others, and to all of my friends and colleagues in the AGSIW who make this possible. And let's hope that we can make a real contribution. Frank did a brilliant job outlining his judgment, with which I generally agree. I think that if I had a concern, it was a concern leading up to the meeting, that we would not escape what is clearly, in my view, the different opinions in the United States about dealing with China. And I don't think we have successfully done that. But President Biden and President Xi, I think as a result of two reasonably successful domestic achievements, have taken a deeper look at the US-China competition and decided that for domestic purposes, it is no longer useful to be contagiously contentious. The real question is over making that work. And Frank has rightly pointed out, this is now handed off to technical experts. My sense is that were I more confident that the technical expertise on both sides had the innovative sense and the inspiration to look at changing the balance, 2 negative C's and 1 positive C do not a successful arrangement make, despite the fact that we all first look to defense and then at offense. But a diplomatic effort with China will be heavily taxed to find areas for future cooperation to offset the questions we have in mind. For example, could the United States begin to take steps that would be noticed by China to reduce some of the area of confrontation, which has the, put it this way, the expression of being a bit more over the top than necessary with respect to current relationships, and that it is not deterring so much as disturbing. And I can think of a number of things. Without getting deep into classified material, I had the job, probably Frank did the same at various places, of approving a monthly reconnaissance schedule of flights on the China coast, which were quite clearly, most importantly, to determine should we have to attack, how we could best do so. They were less collection of information on China's posture with respect to their offensive capabilities, although some of that was there, than they were with respect to China's posture on defensive capabilities. And China knew that, and we knew that. And some slowdown would be a useful signal. And I think that one only tries signals to see whether they help or hurt. One doesn't get overcommitted in that kind of area, but there are other things. John Kerry worked hard. I won't use the crude expression for it, to see whether, in fact, out of the China relationship, we could pull more cooperation on climate change. The independent foreign policy of the Democratic Speaker of the Congress, which has no constitutional basis, but which a president facing an election had to deal with, put him in an uncomfortable position. And it meant that the piece I would have liked to have emphasized disappeared in the defensive pieces for reasons that had little to do with US-China relations, but a great deal to do with electoral success. And that's, I think, something we should be explicit about. It doesn't mean that either Frank or I believe that the US is solely responsible for all of the problems, and that we can think of plenty of things that she did. Guess what? To get a third term in China takes a lot of work. And building up, as she has done over the last dozen years, a distinct flavor of Chinese supranationalism in the face of the United States that has been portrayed to the Chinese public with a degree of aggressive intent that I think is totally belied by an honest understanding of the United States is a problem. The cutoff in communications between us is not good. I think it's not good anywhere. So those are all things that I think we are hopefully in a period where we now may be able to make a few steps forward that begin to build the cooperative place in the relationship, which is more occupied by alphabetic rotundity than it is by actual reality. And let me then just take us one step further. Frank is right. The priority that we must attach to China is very high. But from what I have said, and I think from what Frank has said, it is still an unrealized capital gain to develop that priority to where it is a plus on the ledger of diplomacy rather than a minus. But the good news, as I go back to my first remarks, is that President Biden and President Xi have taken a deep breath and said, maybe it's now time to see if we can shift gears a little bit, to see whether they grind or they propel, and if so, how can we move that forward? And as someone who's gauged his life in diplomacy as Frank has, I'm very glad, because on the bigger question, the strategy of solving diplomatic problems by the use of military force, as I think over the period of time since the end of the Second World War, proved to be supremely successful in terribly important places like Grenada and Panama, and not so good in other places, which importance may be slightly higher on the scale. And I fear that. I fear, too, that Americans have a propensity, whether it is with China, Russia, or Iran, to replace strategic thinking with demonology. And the national ethic is Saturday afternoon football requires that you must destroy your enemy on the sporting field because there's no give, no appeasement other ways. And this is somehow carried over in America's sporting instincts to how we deal with people in the international environment. And everybody knows unconditional surrender is the totally acceptable, absolutely marvelous, but rarely achievable goal of military conflict, unfortunately. But where in our military schools does it teach you that, in fact, the unattainable or the very hard to attain is something that must absolutely dominate the entire strategic concepts you're dealing with in dealing with enemies? And many people have been given credit for the statement that talking to your friends is an obligation. Talking to your enemies is inescapable if you want to succeed, and impossibly bad if, in fact, you're bound for failure. So we are in that kind of a situation. Is our diplomacy gearing for change? With China, yes. With Russia, maybe. The few indications we have that the U.S. is now interested in keeping up channels of communication. And it would be foolish to advocate rushing to some kind of negotiated peace settlement without the most careful preparation. On the other hand, without careful preparation, no move to a peace settlement has a chance of the kind of success you wish to introduce. And we're a long way from that. But we all know that if you wait until you are at the peak of your leverage, you will never find it. It's like, in fact, predicting the stock market.
And nobody should be trying to predict the stock market. I want to come to Russia, but you made a nice reference about taking a deep breath. We expect that President Biden's taken a deep breath, President Xi's taken a deep breath, and I can tell you in this region, a lot of people took a deep breath. Because one of the things we constantly hear here is don't make us choose a side with the US and China, and to a certain extent with US, West, and Russia. And so I want to turn to Russia, but first I want to talk about this not having to choose a side, because that's what's important for this region. The people of this region, or the officials, diplomats you speak to in this region, say that they do not want to have to choose a side between the US and China. They want to have relationships with both. And at times, the messaging, at least from the US, has felt like you have to choose a side. And then that was reciprocated also, sometimes inadvertently, when it came to the whole Ukraine war and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I want to ask you, but I please ask you for a brief remark, and then we'll move to Russia. Do countries in this region have to choose a side between the US and China?
My apologies. I would hope not. And I do not believe that that is the essence of America's approach. Of course, to go back to what Tom Pickering just said, casting up the example of the Saturday afternoon football side, you like to know who was on your side when you won, and you regret who wasn't on your side when you lost. But that's not the way the world works. The world is a much more ambiguous place. And while we do need our friends to understand matters of principle, we seek from them cooperation. But that's cooperation we have to earn by making it possible to cooperate. To believe that this region is indifferent to the Ukraine crisis, I think, is a wrong conclusion. Look at the many consequences of this crisis, not only the violence, but the indirect effects on global finance, the food crisis that is imperiling nations, particularly Horn of Africa, the Middle East, are all direct consequences of the Ukraine war. So there's no real standing aside, and there is an imperative for this region to engage itself in trying to get the parties to bring the war to a conclusion. Not to take sides, but to end the conflict and to help explore ways that will get us to that end game. As to the longer term approach, it's my belief that American diplomacy, to be successful in its competition with China, will have to create fields of cooperative engagement where it's in the interests of nations outside the United States to be party to coalitions that deal with questions that are raised by China. But that's a task that falls heavily on us and on you to respond where you see those opportunities. Not to choose sides between one and the other, but to choose sides based on national interest.
Could I just make one brief point? Because I think Frank opened the door to something that I think could be sharpened now. Not asking us to, put it this way, asking us to avoid asking you to choose sides. Could that be resolved by saying, what's in your greatest interest, an end to this conflict or the avoidance of taking sides?
So if we elaborate further on that, and if we try to see a resolution to the Ukraine war with maintaining channels of communication, I mean, one of the things that you hear from officials, particularly in the Gulf, is we want to maintain channels of communication with both the Russians and the Ukrainians in order to help facilitate that. But how do you see it playing out? How can we get to that point where we end the conflict? What's the off-ramp?
I'm going to make a very strong plea, Mina, when we begin to talk about off-ramps, that I let Tom answer that question, but I'll give you a short view. All wars do end, most 90%, end with a negotiation. Therefore, it's really important that we get to a point where we have a common understanding and conditions on the ground and the timing right to get there. Tom's given terrific thought to this question, so I'm going to turn to him. But I do so with the view that we will one day get to a political outlet or a political endgame. That's going to happen. But what the cost will be and how to structure it, that's a very, very different question. And the role of this region, in my judgment, is to wish well, to press the parties to a conclusion, not to try to be an intermediary, because then those who have the responsibility for the outcome end up blaming you who try to be the intermediary. Wouldn't be there. I believe this region can insist on solving questions that are related to the war, like the food crisis. But its best position is moral suasion, to remind the parties they're losing ground politically if they don't bring the war to a conclusion. But Tom, having said that and having set you up, I'm going to give the floor to you.
Yeah, I think, Frank, I would say one of your postulates in a slightly different way. All wars end with political results. The question is, do you want to participate in setting those, or do you want to have them set by somebody else? And I think both parties understand that. Secondly, I think ending wars does not come through the magic appearance of exit ramps. It comes through a series of hard building of leverages, both military and civilian, that in one way or another bring the parties to a realization that it may be better now to see what we can get at the table. And that often that at the table for difficult wars, and Mr. Putin is clearly one of the hardest people to move, are processes of years. So you are not in a position to estimate 2 years ahead what the leverage arrangement will be that will give you the magic outcome you seek. It is also true that negotiations have their own rhythms, and they have their own processes and possibilities. And some of that has to do with a couple of factors. The beginning to introduce factors in the discussions that can help to deal with the aspirations of both parties in ways where they not engaged are not likely to appear very easily. Others outside can think about these, and they may be the producers of options. But Frank is right, it is not the U.S.'s responsibility to negotiate for Ukraine. But go down to the point where U.S. national interest becomes involved in an outcome. Do we have a responsibility to ourselves and to others, and to what degree is there to be balance in that, or beggar your neighbor to get an end result that you have as a responsible leader to take for your country's interests? So it's easy to say we're going to leave it all to President Zelensky. But we've already demonstrated 2 weeks ago in Jake Sullivan's visit, where guess what dropped out of President Zelensky's list of demands? That Mr. Putin had to disappear from the scene. Now, I would dearly love to see it. It would be an ideal circumstance. And we can all daily pray for it. But the notion that it has to be the sine qua non for starting negotiations means that there probably is not going to be a start to negotiation, because the man who has to decide that is the man who has to decide to leave. And living, he probably won't decide that. So those are all tricky questions. Now, I think it is important to think about the future of this conflict in a constructive way, and a lot of people are doing that. We have two sets of issues, territorial and general. And there are trade-offs between them, but they are not equal. My view is that it may be possible to solve territorial issues stepwise. A certain amount of early withdrawal, a certain amount of future termination of uncertainty through selection by the people living in the territory of where they would like to see themselves go, and a very tricky and sporty course about how you get that determination in a way that allows them truly to reflect their desires. Very hard, but if you don't think ahead of time about how to approach those issues, then you're delaying, when the time comes, your capacity to have some flexibility and build into the strategy of negotiations some of the ways to proceed. The non-territorial questions involve things like, what should be the future long-term status of Ukraine? A bridge country, maybe economically, maybe now with the war very difficult to achieve, but maybe that could evolve. A question that Ukraine would abjure for a time in deciding its final security alignment by one way or another going east or west or staying alone. A necessity inside Ukraine, which I think has been required for a long time, of treating linguistic differences on the basis of equality rather than superiority, and so on. So one can begin to see things here that can make some difference. I'm sure there are many other pieces that can go into the plate, and thinking about them is not predetermining them, and thinking about them is the production of options rather than the production of diktat, and we have to look at it that way.
I think we could spend a lot of time discussing not only Ukraine, but also how you go about getting to political solutions that can be acceptable to all the parties. But I want to shift gears because we're talking about America's place in the world. I'm originally from Iraq, and if I was an American voter, I'd be a single-issue voter, and it would be Iraq. And so I want to talk about Iraq because in some ways, the U.S. and how it's seen in the world is determined by the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And those first 2 decades of this century and America's place in the world, when it was really the sole superpower, has changed as an outcome of both Iraq and Afghanistan. So I want to talk about both of them and looking through the prism of America's place in the world, because we could end up talking about the countries and the dynamics inside those countries, but I want to stick true to the theme of this panel and say to what extent the Iraq War and the withdrawal from Afghanistan together impact America's place in the world, and have lessons been learned in Washington?
Mina, you've put your finger on the heart of an essential American debate and American dilemma. May not always be explicit, but it truly is implicit in the nature of our political discourse. The end of the American engagement with active combat presence in Iraq and the American withdrawal from Afghanistan has had a searing effect on American thinking. And many of us who observe this debate worry that it could have a stultifying effect on what are core American interests. I believe that any move to disengage from the world because we made two fundamental errors would be profoundly wrong. But I believe at the same time that the triumph of basic American national interests will mean that we will continue to be an active player on the world scene. But the means, methods we've been talking about this morning have got to shift. So I find the United States today at an interesting inflection point, looking over its shoulder and looking ahead. Looking ahead, we have to look at the world in a different way, a world that is not dominantly in the responsibility of the United States or subject to American agency, the outcome of which, taken to its extreme, represents Iraq and Afghanistan, and a world in which, like a big high table, there are many guests at that table and nobody sitting at the head of it. And how you develop table manners and live and let live with each other's interests is going to be critical. But Mina, let me close by saying, I think in the end, national interest always comes to bear. And American national interest in this region has, to my way of thinking, been constant since we began to define ourselves as a world power. And you know them. They're pretty clear, but they're consistent. So I'll repeat them. The first and most important interest is the preservation of our national strength, power, and ability to influence world affairs. No nation in the course of world history has been able to do that without having some ability to participate in the shaping of events in the Middle East. It's an historic fact. Second is the vitally important role of hydrocarbons, which are not going to go away. We may be moving to a post-oil economy, but we're not moving to a post-energy economy. And both the role of hydrocarbons inside of energy economy, outside of it, brings this nation and American interests front and center. It does not mean that we will be the consumers of energy sources from this region, but our vital national interests lie in the smooth functioning of the international economy. Without adequate, assured energy supplies will not happen. Third, I make no bones about the fact that we, as Americans, have made a security commitment to the State of Israel. And that will remain a constant for domestic political, but international balance. So when I look at this region, we may be tugged here and pulled there. We may spot China as a huge challenge, but in the end, the core American interests drive us back to a point where we have been since late 40s, early 50s. You can count on a degree of consistency in America's approach to this region.
Ambassador Pickering, your views on whether lessons have been learned from both Afghanistan and Iraq in the U.S. today?
The answer, of course, is easy. Some have and some haven't. We're always in a learning mode. The real question is, how active and flexible are we? And we're a democracy, and a predominant interest always seems to lodge, quite rightly, in solution to the domestic problems. And the task of looking at the midterm elections, for example, against the backdrop of foreign affairs, doubles in difficulty and pales in significance to the domestic issues for us right now. We have to be honest about that. Secondly, those of us who have made our lives in foreign affairs know and understand the importance of commitments around the world, particularly in this region. And Frank has laid those out very, very well. And I think that two mistakes don't make a future, but two really big mistakes are hard to recover from. And we watched, for example, President Obama struggle with this. And we still are, in a sense, working hard, in my view, further to recover on this particular set of problems. And we went through, I think, a period of strategic realignment in favor of Asia, when an absolute conviction that we were totally lashed to a zero-sum choice, when I don't think we were. One of the real trials of diplomacy is you have to test every assumption. And in some ways, the obvious point is how much of the Middle East lies outside of Asia. But the other question is, how much are we dependent on the region? And that's still very large. And the third question is, what is the proportion of U.S. resources that can be applied to foreign policy problems of great interest? And those are not all answerable on the basis that what we have done for the last 10 years is totally binding and not in any way at all flexible enough to admit that we have growing world interests, we have growing world problems, we have growing world integration, we have growing world disintegration. And they're all out there, and they're all very important to us. So my feeling is that there needs to be more openness in American approaches to these kinds of problems if we are going to do what I think we have to do. And I don't know that anybody who saw the imperative of spending more time and attention on Asia thought that we had to take that out of the Middle East or Africa or Latin America or Europe. We're a global power, and we saw ourselves as a unipolar polar power, which I think had its own problems in terms of creation of things that were important to us, in large measure because throughout the Cold War and beyond, our biggest successes were we had the biggest support in the international community. And I think that that's very true in Ukraine. And I think in the long run, the pressures that will be helpful in finding that exit ramp include not only, maybe still predominantly, Ukrainian military capacity to defend itself and to expel Russians. But I think international isolation of Russia, I think an ability somehow to bring down the costs of hydrocarbon fuels are things that are very, very important, not because I want to deprive the UAE or Saudi Arabia of a reasonable income, but I don't want an international aggression to be rewarded by the higher oil prices that is stimulated as a kind of double benefit to the aggressor. And I think we have to look at that. And I've seen Mr. Putin react to changes in oil pricing as a result of market circumstances in the past in ways that indicated that it took him a while to understand that the inevitable trajectory of hydrocarbon prices was not every day always up. And so he had to live with that. And I think that's important. And I think that those are the things that are making a difference to us. And we'll have to see how they play out. But they are the leverages that we can bring to bear at the present time.
Now, part of the changes that are also ongoing geopolitically across the world is what happens in Iran domestically, domestic politics in Israel, how the knock-on effect that is for the region, but also relationships within the US. But I have to be fair and open the floor, so I'm going to have to hold those questions. But I planted those in case anyone wants to ask either question for me. Please do ask your questions. We have the mics there so we can hear you, unless you can... actually, no, you can't speak loudly, because I think for the benefit of people online, we'll need you to speak to the mic. Please identify yourself and ask your question.
Good morning, Ambassadors. Mina, my name is Rob Dean. Thank you very much for that really interesting hour of discussion. Notwithstanding the ongoing JCPOA negotiations and Iran's nuclear capability, what would success look like for a US-Iran relationship going forward?
To me, that's a critically important question, and I am so glad you asked it, because I find all too often our minds get wrapped around the JCPOA and its technology, arguments whether Iran has a nuclear weapon in mind, what level of preparation, and the fear that I think Mohammed Bahroun this morning evidenced in his remarks when he said the region is not at all comfortable with enrichment, while in my judgment, enrichment was an issue that was settled 10, 15 years ago, and the question is not whether you can deprive Iran the ability to enrich, but how do you manage the results of the fact that Iran has a capacity to enrich? So to me, the ultimate objective of the JCPOA was not the achievement of rules to regulate Iran's nuclear behavior. That's a critically important question, that a nuclear-armed Iran or a nuclear-capable Iran changes equations in the Middle East in a manner that serves none of our interests. I agree, absolutely. But the outcome to be rewarding on a sustained basis is the ability to find frameworks for dealing with Iranian pretensions of the extension of Iranian power, of national security, to manage those, to bring Iran in from a period of intense hostility and fear about its surroundings to a point where it reacts with great brutality to threats to its existence. The ultimate purpose of the JCPOA should have been to open a framework of discussions between the United States, between the Gulf, between Iran, begin to build some confidence in dialogue, and begin to work out rules of the road that would contain and define the national interests of the relevant and respective parties. That's the core objective. It was put that way by a former Iranian foreign minister, Mohammad Zarif, when he looked at the JCPOA, and he said we should look at the JCPOA as the floor, not the ceiling of our ambitions. And yet I think we've lost sight of what the ceiling should be. And the ceiling should be a much broader political framework in which to deal with weapons, nuclear issues, drones, missiles, etc., but to deal with the political differences that drive Iran into Iraq, into Lebanon, into Syria, and threaten the core security interests of the Gulf. So that's my ceiling, and where I'd like to see the JCPOA lead us to the ceiling and stop getting lost in the floor.
Just a small remark that often I think when Iran's interventions in countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen are brought up, we think about the security of the Gulf, but ultimately it's also destroying the lives of many people in those countries and what that's meant for the Arab world as it is today. Ambassador Pickering, I wanted you to also broach the question about what do U.S.-Iranian relations look like and how do we get to the ceiling rather than fixate on JCPOA.
They look terrible. And the road forward seems to have gone into a black hole. The U.S. has not given up yet. Whether that will come to pass or not, I do not know. But I agree totally with Frank that the ability to open with Iran a process that can lead to further discussions about areas of difference, and you mentioned many, and the beginning of change looked like it was happening before we pulled out. And the reasons for pulling out seem to me to be so superficially irrelevant to the longer-term possibilities that it is the third great mistake in this region. And that were I to believe there was another way to open the door to the floor, I would be totally in favor of it. Nuclearization in a weapon sense of Iran cannot be in the interest of anybody living within missile range of Iran, which will gradually increase. And that at the same time, the notion that that's the only thing you can ever agree on with Iran is a proposition that has to be tried to be proven. And I think we have an opportunity now, at least, to try it out. So I wish I could tell you I thought we were on the verge of some change, but it's hard to be positive about that. The electoral process in the United States certainly was in some way or other a factor in how the U.S. was dealing with the Iran question. I think that if there was a second mistake in dealing with the JCPOA, it was waiting months to begin the process again, rather than moving as quickly as possible in the aftermath of the 2020 electoral success to see what could be done. And this is wonderful hindsight, and Frank and I used to be paid good money to avoid it.
So, and now you can enjoy it.
So raising all those, so I think there's a particularly difficult problem. I think not yet fully resolved. Whether we will see it resolved in a totally negative way and then have to pick up the pieces, and there are things that we are all thinking about now that are not very delightful, but the notion that we will have to continue to confront a difficult, dangerous, and uncertain Iran is not yet far from the scene. And even if we got to JCPOA, would not be, and the JCPOA every day loses half-life. So as we go along, it's less and less relevant in terms of its capacity to influence outcomes, but at the same time, maybe even more important in its ability to build the floor.
So I am unfortunately in the position to have to close this discussion, as we have to stick to our schedule. thank you so much for your insights and for giving us a lot of food for thought, not only about America's place in the world, but also how the world is going through all these changes at a time when there's so much uncertainty when it comes to climate. And I think the point about John Kerry's efforts and bringing China on board and how that was then scuppered is, I think, again, when we look at hindsight, probably a lost moment and opportunity. But there's always tomorrow, and there's always next efforts of both seasoned diplomats and younger diplomats coming into play. Thank you both very much for your time and your insights, and thank you to the audience.